See here. All right, hey guys, welcome to the Daily Word verse by verse. Grab your Bibles and follow along as we continue in our verse by verse, chapter by chapter, and book by book study through the entire Bible. We're currently studying verse by verse and chapter by chapter the Gospel of Luke, and we are in chapter 6. Now, you remember I said that Luke is, his Gospel is the one that is most excuse me, the one that is most in order of how things took place, and we're going to see that in this chapter because the Sermon on the Mount, which is a good example of this, in Matthew's Sermon on the Mount, we're going to find out from, as Luke recorded, that it was actually 3 sermons that Matthew combined. But let's get right in it. And it says, verse 1 says, on the Sabbath, he passed through the grain fields. His disciples were picking heads of grain, rubbing them in their hands, and eating them. But some of the Pharisees says, why are you doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath? And then Jesus answered them, haven't you read what David and those who were with him did when he was hungry? How he entered the house of God and took and ate the sacred bread, which is not lawful for any but the priests to eat. And he gave some to those who were with him. And then he told them, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. Now, right away, you note, if you kind of compare Matthew's telling of the story with Luke's. Now, remember we said that the Gospel's message are just different viewpoints as the Holy Spirit inspired them. Matthew's Gospel was written mostly written for, I should say, Jews. And so when you go back and you read that, you see a heavy emphasis on Jewish customs. You see Matthew paid attention or recorded more of the interaction with the Jewish emphasis on there. And Luke does it. At the Gentile, you could probably say, well, he's recording the incident, but again, you see this difference between the two and how they kind of record it. One had a Jewish emphasis because Matthew was writing to the Jew. And even that, and you see that the statement comes up, where if you know what this means, you see the phrase over and over. If you know what this means, what is the statement? I lost my thought here. Jesus said you would have mercy. He seeks mercy and not sacrifice. And that's a direct statement in terms of the attitudes towards the law. They were pretending, and in most cases they were, but they were hypocrites about it, but they were strict, trying to say that they kept the law in a strict manner. And this is an example here, as we said before, they wasn't keeping the law. The charge of them violating the law is a false one. What Jesus was violating was their interpretation of the law. He was violating their traditions. The law actually said, and of course Jesus himself writing the law, giving the law to Moses, okay. But and the idea is that the law actually says that it was permissible for what Jesus was doing. In other words, under the law, if you were traveling and you were hungry, it says you could stop at a field and you can eat, okay? And not only can you eat, but you can eat until you was full. And what the law says was, but you could not take anything with you. Sort of like the rules that you have when you go to a smorgasbord, right? You can eat all you want, but you just cannot take any with you. You couldn't even put any in a jar or whatever to save some for later. In other words, you can stop, you can eat, and then you had to keep it going. So Jesus was doing that, and he wasn't violating the law. All right, so verse 6 says, on another Sabbath he entered the synagogue and was teaching. And a man was there whose right hand was paralyzed. And the scribes and the Pharisees were watching him closely to see if he would heal on the Sabbath, so they could find a charge against him. But he knew their thoughts and told the man with the paralyzed hand, get up and stand here. So he got up and stood there. And then Jesus said to him, excuse me, I will ask you, is it lawful on the Sabbath to do what is good, or to do what is evil, to save life or to destroy it? After looking around on them, he told him, stretch out your hand. And he did so, and his hand was restored. They, however, were filled with rage and started discussing with one another what they might do with Jesus. Now, isn't that amazing? Again, the hardness of man. Here you see Jesus performed a miracle in front of them. In our day, we have not seen such miracles. We just haven't. I won't get into the discussion of people that will claim to have either worked miracles or have seen miracles. We use the term very lightly. We use the term miracles and things like that very lightly. And sometimes they're not really miracles. But here they saw this miracle. This man's hand was paralyzed. In fact, it was kind of withered. And Jesus heals the man. And immediately, instead of saying, this man is working the power of God, they says, how can we kill him? That just, to me, wow. Okay, verse 12. Now, during those days, he went out to the mountain to pray. And he spent all night in prayer to God. And when daylight came, he summoned his 12. And he chose 12 of them. He summoned his disciples. And he chose 12 of them. And he also named them apostles. So we sort of see this is the first. They were the difference between a disciple, and of course, and the apostles here. We're going to see in this book especially that there were many disciples. And as leaders, he named 12, the 12 apostles, to be his eyewitness and leaders. They were also gatekeepers of the truth. So obviously the 12 was with Jesus on more occasions than the other disciples. We're going to see that at one point he's going to send out 70 disciples. And even beyond the 70, there was an innumerable number of people, of disciples. There was quite a crowd that followed Jesus. And when we get to the book of Acts, you see that they're gonna to choose Judas' replacement. There are 12 apostles here. To choose Judas' replacement, they're going to choose someone. And again, it's from this extended number of disciples that had to have been with them the same amount of time. It's almost kind of like alternate jurors. In some cases, you have cases where, of course, you have 12 juries, and then you have another 12 set of juries, so that if something happened to the 12, they could pull from those 12, but those 12 were actually watching the trial as well. That they're up to date on that. So this disciples is the same here. So the disciples were those who followed Jesus, and they were faithful to follow Jesus. But yet they didn't necessarily follow him everywhere at all times. The disciples, and now he's kind of separating 12 of those disciples, and he's going to officially name them apostles. And after his ascension, they would then go forth. They would be the leaders of the church, the gatekeepers of the truth. So, verse 14, he says, Simon, whom he also named Peter, and Andrew his brother, then James and John, Philip, and Bartholomew. Now, it's kind of interesting because, as I kind of mentioned in the last study, these six, he chose. They lived in the city of Bethsaida. I don't know what it was about the city of Bethsaida, but they all lived there. And of course, James and John and Peter and Andrew were, as we saw last time, they were fishers. They were in business together. Andrew's father was with him. They also were more, I'm going to note here, they were also more devoted to the law. You could say they were more religious. Okay, that's just kind of like a trivial note. Verse 15 says, Matthew, we were introduced to him last time, Matthew, the tax collector, and Thomas, known as Doubting Thomas. And then it says James, the son of Alphaeus. We don't know too much about him. Simon, called a zealot. Kind of interesting that this zealot. Now, later we'll get familiar with zealots, with the person of Barabbas. Zealots were these militia groups, these little factions, and they constantly were working to overthrow the government. And that's how Barabbas ended up in trouble, because he caused an insurrection, committed murder, and he was actually should have been crucified for that. But as we know, they chose Barabbas instead of Jesus. But here's this zealot who his ideologies certainly would have been in conflict with Jesus. Of course, he's following Jesus right now. But the fact that he's a zealot and following Jesus, it is strange. There are some people who think that Judas was probably a zealot, and that he, in his betrayal, that he had actually good motives, and that he was attempting to, by the method, he was attempting to motivate Jesus to rise up. Okay, in other words, when he betrayed Jesus, and then he brought the soldiers there, in his mind, Jesus would have said, "Well, rise up, troops," and then thus they would have started the rebellion. Now, on that note, there were concerns that Jesus could start a rebellion. One of the legitimate concerns about the Pharisees was that Jesus could, of course, because of his popularity, he could certainly sway the people. However, that claim that Judas was doing that has absolutely no merit, not one shred of scriptural evidence to back it up, not one. But it is interesting that he has this zealot, and he's identified here as a zealot. And then he says, then he says, verse 16, Judas, the son of James. Now this would be a different Judas. And he says, and Judas Iscariot, who became a traitor. Judas is always named as the traitor. Always. He's always named as the traitor. So, and he was a thief and a traitor. He was never anything else. So, let's see. Oh, all right. Now, again, so these apostles, these were his apostles, and these were, they would be officially, okay, what we will call foundational apostles, meaning they would be gatekeepers to the truths that Jesus would have. Now, Peter, James, and John were out of the 12, were Jesus' inner circle. They saw more, heard more, and was with Jesus on more occasions than even the 9. Okay. Of course, after the book of Acts, most of the apostles we don't know anything about, other than them being referred to in the book of Acts as the apostles. So beyond that, you kind of go by history. Now, the church history on the apostles, other than the book of Acts, so anything outside of the book of Acts, not much is known about them. And the history is not a hardline history. So, for example, we're told that Peter is crucified. He requested to be crucified upside down. And that may be true, but we have to say that you unlike some historical fact, like we know Jesus existed as a historical figure. That's a fact. The apostles existed as a historical fact, but their individual lives, it is believed, for example, Thomas went into India. But people will say that's church tradition, and when you use the term tradition, then meaning that's what people commonly believe, that some people believe, but they really don't have historical facts to back that up, and so that makes them. So their lives outside of the book of Acts, beyond the book of Acts, we should say, we don't have a lot on these apostles. They were used as foundational gatekeepers and truth keepers. We do know that. Now, verse 17, after coming down with them, he stood on the level place with a large crowd of his disciples and a great number of people from all Judea and Jerusalem and from the seacoast of Tyre and Sidon. And they came to hear him and to be healed of their diseases. And those tormented by unclean spirits were made well. And the whole crowd was trying to touch him because power was coming out from him and healing them all. Now, this is going to be Luke's rendering or telling of the Sermon on the Mount. And again, the first thing would be again, one of the keys to understand this is that this is, and we spent a lot of time when we went through Matthew. So the key is he is speaking to his disciples. This is his criteria on what a disciple should be. In other words, this is his criteria for discipleship, not ours, but his. Okay. And by the way, it is quite different. You'd be surprised that what he expects from us. Verse 20 again. Then looking up at his disciples, see, he said, "You who are poor are blessed, because the kingdom of God is yours. You who are now hungry are blessed, because you will be filled. You who now reap are blessed, because you will laugh. You are blessed when people hate you, and when they exclude you, insult you, and slander your name as evil because of the Son of Man. Rejoice in that day and leap for joy. And take note, your reward is great in heaven, for this is the way of the ancestors used to treat the prophets." Now, if you notice, even here in certain in Bibles, the title here, and by the way, these titles are they're not inspired. God, this was men or scholars, whoever, who put these Bibles together, who put this title on here. The Beatitudes. Nowhere that the scripture says Beatitudes. And actually the word Beatitudes has come from the word blessed. It's sort of taking the word blessed. Now, the word blessed means to be happy. That's all the word blessed means, to be in a state of happy. You can say, sometimes you hear people say this, "How you doing?" "I'm blessed and highly favored." Well, the idea is that the word blessing means to be, again, in a state of happiness. And what he is saying is that you want to be in a state of happiness that God places you in. Now, in the case of the Christian, their state of happiness has nothing to do with their physical surroundings. So you could say in a secular world, there are secular people. They are blessed. Their lives are blessed. Why? Because their money or privilege, meaning their wealth, privilege, has, they don't experience some of the same thing that other people experience. Okay? However, they don't have inner peace. At least they don't have it the way God promises. Now, that's important to understand here, because the term, these are what Jesus is referring to his disciples, again, or qualities, characteristic qualities. In other words, if you want to be his disciple, one of the things he says is, let me go back to it here, is one, poor. Now, this wasn't meaning here as in some traditions, Christian traditions, and it still sticks today, that people think when he says you are poor, that he is speaking to people impoverished. In other words, he's not speaking to impoverished people. The idea there is poor in spirit. Why? Because the idea is when you come to God, if you come to God full, that is to say, if you come to God and you in yourself says, I have no need. Now he's saying you are not a blessed person. You can also say God is saying, I'm not going to bless you. If a prideful person who does not humble himself before God, and that can be anyone, of any economical status. You can be the poorest of poor. You can be destitute. You can be sick. And you could and have the hardest of hearts towards God. So the idea is that when you come to God, your spirit, you should be poor. And when he says hungry, he's talking about a spiritual hunger that only God can fill. Okay, that only God can fill. Okay. And then he says this one here. When you weep, you are blessed, because you will laugh. And the idea there is, again, remember in the 5th chapter, last chapter, Jesus tells Peter, right? He steps in his boat, he preaches a sermon to the crowd of people. And then after he preaches, he tells Peter, pull out for a catch. Peter says to him, we labored all night. Jesus, but okay. He says, okay, at your word, we'll let down the nets. But I want you to know, Jesus, right? We've toiled all night. They go out, they catch this huge catch of fish, so much so that their boats were sinking. And the first reaction from Peter was, Lord, get away from me. Stay away from me. I'm a sinful man. He was immediately aware of his sinfulness. And there is something when you're not aware of your sinfulness before God. There's something it goes to this right here. You can't be his disciple, a true disciple. If having been taught the scriptures, you're not aware of your sinfulness, your weakness, there's something wrong spiritually with you. So this is what he's talking about, these qualities that you come to God empty. You come to God in mourning over what? Your sinfulness, your wretchedness. Every human being is wretched before God. All have sinned and come short of the glory of God. Every one of us. So contrast that with the Pharisees. They did not feel as though they needed anything from God. They felt in their righteousness, their self-righteousness, they were full. They had no lack. And thus, notice, instead of embracing Jesus, they rejected him. Despite them knowing the scriptures. You remember also in chapter 5, the power of the Lord was present. They came to this minister's meeting and the power of the Lord was present to heal them. And do you notice they didn't get healed? And some of them were sick. Right? In other words, the power of the Lord was present to heal them. Some of them were sick. But because in their minds and in their hearts, and they were rejecting God's testimony, which was ample before them, they were not blessed people. So if you want to be Jesus' disciples, you have to empty yourself. Right? You have to empty yourself. And then God fills you with his presence, with his spirit, with his life. God fills you. And then because of that, you are a blessed person. We often think of blessed as our physical surroundings. If you want to look at, I don't know, when I say look at, just kind of, the only way you can look at it is to, through news reports. So there are a lot of entertainment, gossip shows like that. But they tell you sometimes the story of certain celebrities. You kind of notice this pattern between celebrities. Some. So you'll see a person who will work hard, right? A rags to riches story. They go from nothing to having it all. In some cases, being extremely rich. So they value that wealth. Now, they may value it in a greedy way, but they still value it. They value what they worked for. Then there's their children who grow up in that extreme wealth. And you think about how they live. Think about some of the choices that they make. They grow up having everything, so their perspective of life is different because they had it all. They have it all. So the question becomes, how can they be blessed? Now I said they're rich, but how can they be blessed? How can they have it? How can they be filled? And that's what he's saying right here. You can only be filled by God. Now they have a fraction of their worth. And I'm good. And you think about why then suicide, drugs, all of these things, despite the fact that they have incredible wealth. You ask yourself, why? See, so the term, again, the term blessed here is the direct result of being, as a result of God blessing your life, putting his hands on your life. That's what makes you blessed. Now, we also got to look at this last one before we move on. And look at then verse 22. He says, you are blessed when people hate you. Okay. When they exclude you, insult you, and slander your name as evil because of the Son of Man. Now that statement there, keep this in mind. This is what we call persecution, suffering, Christian suffering, biblical suffering is always a direct result of your faith. Notice he says here that people will hate you, insult you, slander your name as evil because of the Son of Man. Now, he's not saying if people hate you because you're just a horrible person, if people hate you because you're doing things to deserve it, that's not suffering. So in other words, in this context here, in this, what he's specifically saying here is that because of the Son of Man, that people will hate you. So understand that part of the blessedness is you're not going to fit in the world. You're not going to fit into the world. And so many times people think they can fit into the world. Why? But we do. But we're not going to fit into the world. And you think about now whether it's political, social, whatever, our cultural. Many Christians are kind of deceived because they're trying to fit into the world. Again, there's a lot of ways to go with that. We're going to pick it up here at verse number 24 next time. And then we on. But these are the qualities he is saying that when you come to Jesus, you come to him empty. And then he fills you. You come to him with an awareness of your lack. All right, guys. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you in the next study. All right.